In 577 AD, three British kings made their final stand against the rising tide of Saxon ambition on a windswept hill called Diorham, and our silver-armoured GoodKnight stood witness as Coinmail, Condidan, and Farren Mail fell beneath West Saxon blades in the battle that would forever sever the ancient bonds between the Britons of Wales and their kinsmen in the distant southwest. As King Ceawlin and his son Cuthwain led their warriors across the rolling hills of Gloucestershire, this wasn't merely another territorial skirmish. It was the moment when the last echoes of Roman Britain died, when three great cities passed from British hands to Saxon rule, and when the very map of early medieval England was redrawn in blood. Watch as our immortal knight witnesses the precise instant when Gloucester, Cirencester, and Bath, those proud remnants of imperial glory, became Saxon prizes, as ancient alliances crumbled like autumn leaves, and as the cultural heart of post-Roman Britain was torn asunder by the relentless march of Germanic conquest. From the desperate charge of British cavalry across morning mist to the haunting silence that followed the last clash of shields, every moment of this epic tale shaped the destiny of a nation still struggling to define itself in the shadow of fallen Rome. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to history's greatest turning points, where our eternal knight in silver armor guides you through the rise and fall of kingdoms with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which pivotal moment in early medieval Britain you'd like the GoodKnight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that fateful morning in 577 AD when three kings died and the fate of Britain was decided forever. A GoodKnight story. The Battle of Diorham, 577 AD, Chapter 1. The Weight of Silver Dawn. The morning mist clung to the Cotswold hills like the breath of sleeping giants, and the GoodKnight felt its cold fingers probe the joints of his silver armor as he stood motionless on the ridge above what the Saxons called Diorham. The year was 577 in the Christian reckoning, though such dates meant little to one who had walked through centuries of mortal conflict. What mattered was the weight of this moment, the way the very air seemed to thicken with the approach of destiny, the way the ancient stones beneath his feet seemed to whisper of endings and beginnings. Below him, in the valley that stretched toward the distant Severn, two armies prepared for a battle that would reshape the very soul of Britain. The GoodKnight had seen many such mornings, had felt this same electric tension in the air before Hastings, before Agincourt, before countless forgotten fields where men died for causes they barely understood. But this morning felt different. This morning carried the weight of an entire world's ending. The silver of his armor caught the first pale rays of sunlight, filtering through the mist, sending brief flashes of light across the hillside like signals from another age. He had worn this armor through the collapse of Rome itself, had stood in the shadow of Hadrian's wall as the legions marched south for the final time, had watched the great cities of Britannia slowly empty as their citizens fled to safer lands or simply faded into the growing darkness of the 5th century. Now, more than a century and a half later, he stood witness to what might be the final act in that long, slow tragedy. The GoodKnight's thoughts drifted to the three cities that lay scattered across the landscape below. Gloucester, Cirencester, and Bath. Once they had been jewels in the crown of Roman Britain. Glevum, with its proud colonia status and its veteran legionaries. Corinium Dobunorum, the gleaming capital of the Dobunni tribe, transformed by Roman engineering into a marvel of stone and mosaic. Aquae Sulis, where the sacred springs had drawn pilgrims from across the empire to bathe in waters blessed by both Roman and Celtic gods. But that was then. Now, as the good knight gazed across the morning landscape, he could see the truth that the coming battle would reveal. The cities were shadows of their former selves, Gloucester largely abandoned, its forum crumbling, its amphitheatre slowly being reclaimed by weeds and weather. Cirencester, though still fortified, was a pale echo of its former glory, its population scattered, its great buildings falling into disrepair. And Bath, beautiful Bath, where the sacred springs still flowed, but where the great bathing complex had been converted into workshops and lime kilns, where burials now took place in the very drains that had once carried away the waters of Roman luxury. The good knight understood what the warriors gathering below did not yet comprehend. This battle was not truly about conquering thriving cities. It was about claiming the ghosts of empire, about placing Saxon hands upon the bones of Roman Britain and declaring a new age begun. The three British kings who would die this day, Coinmail, Condidan, and Farinmail, were not defending bustling urban centres. They were defending memory itself, the last flickering flame of a world that had already passed into legend. A sound drifted up from the valley, the low, rhythmic chanting of Saxon warriors preparing for battle. The good knight had heard such chants before, in the forests of Germania, in the marshlands of Frisia, wherever the Germanic tribes gathered their courage for war. It was a sound like distant thunder, like the growling of some great beast awakening from slumber. Mixed with it came the higher, more melodic voices of British warriors, singing in the old tongue that had echoed across these hills since before Caesar's legions first set foot on British soil. The good knight closed his eyes and let the sounds wash over him. In his mind, he could see the pattern of what was to come, not through any supernatural foresight, but through the hard-earned wisdom of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the ebb and flow of peoples across the map of Europe. The Saxons would win this day. King Ceolin and his son Cuthwine would claim their victory, would add 3 more cities to their growing kingdom of Wessex. But their triumph would be hollow in ways they could not yet understand, for they would be conquering ruins, claiming dominion over emptiness. Yet perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps it was right that the new world should be built upon the bones of the old, that Saxon halls should rise where Roman villas had crumbled, that Germanic kings should hold court in lands where Celtic chieftains had once ruled. The good knight had learned, through his long centuries of wandering, that history was not a straight line, but a spiral, each age building upon the ruins of the last, each people claiming the inheritance of those who had come before. The mist began to thin as the sun climbed higher, revealing more clearly the 2 forces arrayed in the valley below. The Saxon army was a sight to stir the blood. Hundreds of warriors in their war gear, their shields painted with the symbols of their clans, their spears glinting like a forest of steel. At their head rode King Ceolin, a man in the prime of his power, his ambition written in every line of his bearing. Beside him was his son Cuthwine, younger but no less fierce, his eyes bright with the prospect of glory. The good knight had observed Ceolin's rise with interest. Here was a king who understood the new realities of post-Roman Britain, who grasped that power now flowed not from the crumbling cities, but from the loyalty of warriors, from the ability to hold land and defend it against all comers. Ceolin had already proven himself in battle, had carved out a kingdom in the Thames Valley and beyond. Now he sought to expand that kingdom westward, to claim the Severn Valley and all the rich lands that lay beyond. But expansion was never simply about land. The good knight knew that Ceolin's true goal was to sever the connection between the Britons of Wales and their kinsmen in the southwest peninsula. By controlling the corridor of land between the Severn and the sea, the West Saxons could effectively isolate the two British populations, preventing them from supporting each other in times of crisis. It was a strategy worthy of a Roman general, and perhaps that was fitting. For Ceolin, like all the successful barbarian kings, had learned much from the empire he was helping to replace. On the other side of the valley, the British forces presented a more complex picture. The good knight could see the banners of three separate kingdoms, the personal standards of coinmail, condidan, and farinmail. These were not the unified legions of Rome, but rather the war bands of Celtic kings, each group loyal first to their own lord, bound together only by the common threat they faced. It was both their strength and their weakness, the fierce personal loyalty that made each warrior fight like a lion, but also the lack of unified command that could lead to confusion and disaster in the heat of battle. The good knight studied the British kings through the clearing mist. Coinmail, whose name meant Hound of Battle, was a veteran warrior whose scars spoke of many campaigns. Condidan, younger but no less determined, bore himself with the pride of one who had never known defeat. And Farinmail, whose kingdom lay closest to the Saxon advance, had the desperate courage of a man fighting for his very survival. These were not the last Romans, as some later chroniclers would claim. They were something new. British kings who had emerged from the chaos of the 5th century, who had built their power on the ruins of Roman administration, who ruled not through imperial appointment, but through the ancient bonds of kinship and loyalty that had governed Celtic society since time immemorial. They were the inheritors of both Roman and Celtic traditions, and in their persons, the two great streams of British culture flowed together. But inheritance, the good knight reflected, was a fragile thing. It required not just the will to claim it, but the strength to hold it. And as he watched the British forces make their final preparations, he could see the signs that troubled him. The way some warriors glanced nervously at their neighbors, the way the three kings conferred in urgent whispers, the way their battle line seemed somehow less solid than the Saxon formation across the valley. The sun was fully up now, burning away the last wisps of mist and revealing the battlefield in all its stark clarity. The hill of Diorham rose like a great green whale from the surrounding countryside, its slopes dotted with ancient earthworks and standing stones that spoke of peoples who had fought and died here long before either Saxon or Briton had set foot on this island. At its base, a small stream meandered through water meadows where cattle had grazed in peaceful times. Now those meadows would run red before the day was done. The good knight felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always came before battle, not fear, for he had long since moved beyond such mortal concerns, but rather a deep sadness for what was about to unfold. He had seen too many young men die, too many kingdoms fall, too many dreams shatter on the hard reality of steel and blood. Yet he also understood that this was the way of the world, that change came not through gentle persuasion, but through the clash of arms, that new ages were born in violence and baptized in blood. A horn sounded from the Saxon lines, a deep, mournful note that echoed off the surrounding hills like the voice of fate itself. It was answered by the war horns of the Britons, their higher, more urgent tones weaving together in a harmony that spoke of ancient traditions and desperate courage. The good knight straightened in his saddle, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his sword. The time for reflection was ending. The time for action had begun. But even as the two armies began their slow advance toward each other, the good knight found his thoughts turning to the deeper currents that had brought them to this moment. This was not simply a battle between Saxon and Briton, between pagan and Christian, between new and old. This was the culmination of a process that had been unfolding for more than a century. the slow transformation of Roman Britain into something entirely new, something that would eventually become England. The good knight had witnessed the beginning of that transformation. He had been there when the last Roman governors sailed away from British shores, leaving behind a province that had known 4 centuries of imperial rule. He had watched as the great villa estates were abandoned, as the cities emptied, as the complex web of Roman administration simply dissolved like morning mist. In its place had come chaos: Saxon raiders from across the North Sea, Irish pirates from the west, Pictish war bands from the north, and everywhere the desperate struggles of British kings trying to hold together the fragments of a shattered world. But chaos, the good knight had learned, was also opportunity. From the wreckage of Roman Britain had emerged new forms of power, new ways of organizing society, new identities that drew upon both Roman and Celtic traditions while creating something entirely fresh. The Saxon kingdoms were part of that process, as were the British kingdoms that now faced them across the valley of Diorham. Both were children of the same historical moment. Both were responses to the same fundamental challenge: how to create order and meaning in a world where the old certainties had crumbled. The answer, it seemed, lay in war. Not war as an end in itself, but war as the crucible in which new identities were forged, new loyalties tested, new boundaries drawn. The battle that was about to unfold would determine not just who controlled the Severn Valley, but what kind of society would emerge from the ashes of Roman Britain. Would it be Saxon, with its emphasis on personal loyalty and warrior culture? Would it be British, with its blend of Celtic tradition and Christian faith? Or would it be something else entirely? Some new synthesis that drew upon all the streams of culture that flowed together in this island at the edge of the world. The good knight suspected that the answer would be more complex than either side imagined. Victory in battle was one thing. Building a lasting civilization was quite another. The Saxons might win the day, might claim the 3 cities and the lands between, but they would also inherit the problems that had brought down their predecessors. How would they govern a mixed population of Saxon settlers and British natives? How would they maintain the complex systems of agriculture and trade that sustained civilized life? How would they defend their new territories against the next wave of invaders who would surely come? These were questions for the future. For now, there was only the immediate reality of 2 armies converging on a hillside in Gloucestershire, of men preparing to kill and die for causes they might not fully understand, but believed in with all their hearts. The good knight had seen it all before, yet each time it moved him in ways he could not fully explain. Perhaps it was the sheer human courage on display, the willingness of mortal men to face death for something greater than themselves. Perhaps it was the tragic beauty of it all, the way individual lives became part of a larger story that would echo through the centuries. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that he, too, was part of this story, that his own immortal journey was bound up with the rise and fall of kingdoms, the clash of cultures, the endless human struggle to create meaning in a world that often seemed meaningless. He was not just an observer, but a participant, not just a witness, but a character in the great drama of history itself. The Saxon war cry rose from the valley below, a sound like breaking thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was answered by the British battle shout, fierce and defiant, carrying with it the accumulated pride and desperation of a people fighting for their very existence. The good knight felt the familiar stirring in his blood, the call to action that had driven him through countless battles across the centuries. But this time, something was different. This time, he felt not just the excitement of impending combat, but also a deep sense of ending, as if he were witnessing not just another battle, but the conclusion of an entire age. The world that had emerged from the collapse of Rome was itself passing away, giving birth to something new and strange and wonderful. The Battle of Deorham would be remembered not just for who won or lost, but as the moment when one chapter of British history ended and another began. Chapter 2. The Ghosts of Empire. The good knight urged his horse forward, picking his way carefully down the hillside toward the valley floor, where destiny waited. His silver armor caught the morning light, sending brief flashes across the landscape like signals from another world. He had chosen his position carefully, close enough to witness every detail of the coming battle, yet far enough from either army to avoid being drawn into the immediate conflict. It was a delicate balance he had perfected over centuries of warfare, the art of being present without being participant, of observing without interfering in the great currents of history. As he descended, his thoughts turned to the 3 cities that would change hands this day, if the Saxon victory unfolded as he suspected it would. Gloucester, Cirencester, and Bath. Their very names carried the weight of centuries, the accumulated dreams and ambitions of generations who had lived and died in their shadows. But what were they now, really? What would Ceolin and Cuthwine actually be claiming when they declared these cities conquered? The good knight had visited all 3 in recent years, had walked their empty streets and explored their crumbling buildings. The reality was far different from the glorious image that their names still conjured. Gloucester, once proud Glevum, where Roman veterans had built their retirement homes and raised their families, was now a ghost town. Its forum stood empty, weeds growing between the paving stones where merchants had once hawked their wares. The amphitheater, where gladiators had fought and died for the entertainment of the crowds, was slowly being reclaimed by nature, its wooden seats rotted away, its arena floor carpeted with wildflowers. He had stood in the ruins of the basilica, where Roman magistrates had once dispensed justice according to the ancient laws of the empire, and heard only the whisper of wind through broken walls and the scurrying of small animals in the rubble. A few families still lived in the city, huddled in the remains of what had once been grand townhouses, but they were like shadows of their former selves, clinging to the memory of better times while struggling simply to survive. Cirencester told a similar story, though there the decline was perhaps less complete. The city had been fortified in recent decades, its walls rebuilt and strengthened against the growing Saxon threat. But fortification could not restore what had been lost, the complex web of trade and administration that had made Corinium Dobanorum the beating heart of the Cotswolds. The great mansions with their elaborate mosaics stood empty, their roofs collapsed, their gardens overgrown. The workshops that had once produced pottery and metalwork for markets across Britain had fallen silent. The good knight had met one of the last inhabitants, an elderly man who claimed to remember when the city had been truly alive, when its streets had bustled with merchants and craftsmen, when its theaters had echoed with laughter and applause. But that had been decades ago, before the final collapse of the Roman tax system, before the last of the great villa estates had been abandoned, before the roads that connected Cirencester to the wider world had become too dangerous to travel. And Bath, beautiful, tragic Bath, where the sacred springs still flowed as they had for thousands of years, where the Romans had built their magnificent temple complex to honor both Minerva and the Celtic goddess Sulis. The good knight had bathed in those waters himself in the days when the great complex had still functioned, when pilgrims had come from across the empire to seek healing and spiritual renewal. Now the baths were cold and empty, their elaborate heating systems long since broken down, their marble decorations stripped away by scavengers. He had watched workmen converting part of the complex into a lime kiln, burning the very stones that had once been carved with prayers and dedications to create mortar for humbler buildings. It was a perfect metaphor for the age, the glorious past being literally consumed to build a more modest future. In one of the old bath drains, he had seen a burial, a simple grave that spoke of a time when the sacred had become merely practical, when temples became workshops and baths became graveyards. Yet even in their decline, these cities retained a power that went beyond their physical reality. They were symbols, repositories of memory and meaning that transcended their current state of decay. When Seolin claimed them, he would not just be taking possession of buildings and land, he would be claiming the inheritance of Rome itself, declaring himself the rightful heir to an empire that had once ruled the known world. The GoodKnight understood this symbolism better than most. He had seen it before, in other times and places, when barbarian kings had seized Roman cities, not for their immediate value, but for what they represented. It was a way of legitimizing conquest, of transforming mere military victory into something approaching divine sanction. By ruling from the same places where Roman governors had held court, Saxon kings could claim a continuity that made their power seem natural and inevitable. But there was irony in this too. The very emptiness of the cities made them more powerful as symbols, not less. A thriving Gloucester might have been difficult to govern, its population potentially rebellious, its complex urban systems challenging to maintain. An empty Gloucester was a blank slate, a place where Saxon kings could write their own stories without having to accommodate the inconvenient realities of existing inhabitants and their competing claims. The sound of marching feet drew the GoodKnight's attention back to the immediate present. The Saxon army was advancing in good order, their shields locked together in the traditional wall formation that had served Germanic warriors well for centuries. At their head rode King Seolin, his presence unmistakable even at a distance. The GoodKnight had observed many kings over the centuries, and he recognized in Seolin the particular combination of ambition and pragmatism that marked truly successful rulers. Seolin was not fighting this battle out of mere bloodlust or tribal hatred. He was pursuing a carefully calculated strategy of expansion that would secure his kingdom's western frontier while opening new lands for Saxon settlement. The king understood, perhaps better than his enemies, that the future of Britain lay not in clinging to the remnants of Roman civilization, but in building something new upon its foundations. Beside Seolin rode his son Cuthwine, and the GoodKnight could see in the younger man's bearing the eager anticipation of a warrior about to prove himself in battle. This would be Cuthwine's chance to demonstrate that he was worthy to inherit his father's kingdom, that the royal blood flowed strong in his veins. The GoodKnight had seen many such young princes over the years, some of whom had gone on to greatness, while others had fallen in their first real test of combat. The Saxon army itself was a formidable sight. These were not the wild raiders of earlier generations, but disciplined warriors who had learned the arts of war through constant practice. Many bore the scars of previous battles, veterans who had fought their way across southern Britain in the long campaign of conquest that had brought them to this moment. Their weapons were well maintained, their armor serviceable if not elaborate, their shields painted with the symbols of their clans and war bands, but it was their discipline that impressed the GoodKnight most. They advanced in formation, maintaining their lines despite the uneven ground, responding to the horn calls of their commanders with the precision of men who had drilled together for years. This was not a mob, but an army, and that distinction would likely prove decisive in the coming battle. On the British side, the picture was more complex. The GoodKnight could see the banners of 3 separate kingdoms, each with its own traditions and methods of warfare. Coinmail's men were mountain fighters, used to the rough terrain of the Welsh borderlands, skilled with spear and javelin. Condidan's warriors came from the river valleys, where they had learned to fight both on foot and on horseback, adapting their tactics to the varied landscape of their homeland. Farinmail's forces were perhaps the most desperate, for they were fighting literally for their homes, their families, their very existence as a people. The British battle line was longer than the Saxon formation, but the GoodKnight could see that it was also thinner, more fragmented. The 3 kings had managed to coordinate their forces for this battle, but they had not truly unified them. Each contingent remained loyal first to its own lord, and that divided loyalty could prove fatal when the pressure of combat tested every bond of discipline and courage. Yet there was something magnificent about the British army as well, something that spoke to the GoodKnight's deepest understanding of what it meant to be human. These men were not fighting for conquest or glory, but for survival itself. They were the inheritors of a tradition that stretched back through the mists of time, through the Roman centuries to the ancient Celtic kingdoms that had ruled this land when the world was young. In their persons, the accumulated wisdom and courage of generations found expression. The GoodKnight could see it in the way they held themselves, in the proud tilt of their heads, in the fierce light that burned in their eyes. They knew they were outnumbered, knew that defeat would mean not just death, but the end of their world. Yet they stood firm, ready to sell their lives dearly, ready to make the Saxons pay in blood for every foot of ground they claimed. As the two armies drew closer together, the GoodKnight found himself thinking about the deeper currents that had brought them to this moment. This was not just a battle between two peoples, but a collision between two different visions of what Britain could become. The Saxons represented the future, a new way of organizing society based on personal loyalty and warrior culture, a system that was flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances while strong enough to impose order on chaos. The Britons represented continuity, the attempt to preserve something of the old world, to maintain the connections between past and present that gave life meaning and purpose. They were fighting not just for territory, but for memory itself, for the right to remain who they had always been in a world that seemed determined to transform them into something else entirely. Both visions had their merits, the GoodKnight reflected. The Saxon system was undeniably effective at creating military power and expanding territory. It had already proven its worth in the conquest of much of southern and eastern Britain, and it would likely prove itself again this day. But it was also inherently unstable, dependent on the personal qualities of individual leaders, vulnerable to the kind of succession crises that could tear kingdoms apart. The British system, with its emphasis on tradition and continuity, offered a different kind of strength. The deep roots that could weather many storms, the accumulated wisdom of generations, the sense of identity that transcended individual lives and deaths. But it was also rigid, slow to adapt to changing circumstances, vulnerable to more dynamic and aggressive neighbors. Perhaps, the GoodKnight thought, the future would belong to neither system in its pure form, but to some synthesis that combined the best elements of both. Perhaps the real significance of this battle lay not in determining which side would win, but in creating the conditions under which such a synthesis could eventually emerge. The horn calls were growing more frequent now, the final signals passing between commanders as they made their last preparations. The GoodKnight could feel the tension in the air, that electric moment before battle when time seemed to slow and every detail became preternaturally clear. He had experienced it countless times before, yet it never failed to move him. This moment when individual human beings prepared to transcend their mortal limitations, to become part of something larger than themselves. He thought of the 3 British kings who would die this day, according to the chronicles that would be written centuries later. Coinmail, Condidan, and Farinmail. Their names would be remembered long after their kingdoms had crumbled to dust, preserved in the amber of historical record as symbols of a world that had passed away. But what were they thinking now, in these final moments before the storm broke? Did they sense their approaching doom, or did they still hope for victory against the odds? The GoodKnight suspected they knew, on some level, that this was their last battle. There was something in their bearing, in the way they sat their horses and surveyed the Saxon lines, that spoke of men who had made their peace with fate. They were not fighting to win, but to ensure that their deaths would have meaning, that their sacrifice would be remembered and honored by those who came after. It was a noble sentiment, and one that the GoodKnight had encountered many times in his long journey through history. The willingness to die for something greater than oneself was perhaps the most distinctively human trait. the quality that separated men from beasts and mortals from gods. It was what made these brief, fragile lives so precious, so worthy of remembrance and honor. The Saxon war cry rose again, closer now, and the good knight could see individual faces in their ranks. Young men and old, veterans and novices, all united in their determination to claim victory this day. They too were fighting for something greater than themselves, for the dream of a new kingdom, a new way of life, a new chapter in the long story of human civilization. The British response came immediately, a sound that seemed to echo from the very stones of the ancient landscape, carrying with it the voices of all who had lived and died in this place since the world began. It was defiant and proud and heartbreakingly beautiful, the last song of a world that was passing away. The good knight straightened in his saddle, his hand moving to his sword hilt in an unconscious gesture that spoke of centuries of training and experience. The moment of truth was at hand. The battle that would reshape the map of Britain was about to begin. Chapter 3. The Clash of Worlds. The first clash came not with the thunderous collision that poets would later describe, but with the whisper of arrows cutting through morning air. The good knight watched as British archers, positioned on the flanks of their battle line, sent their shafts arcing high over the advancing Saxon shields. The arrows fell like deadly rain, and he could hear the sharp crack of iron points striking wood and leather, the occasional cry of a warrior finding a gap in the shield wall. But the Saxons pressed forward without breaking stride. This was what they had trained for, what their fathers had taught them and their fathers before them. The patient advance under missile fire, the steady march that would bring them close enough to use their spears and swords. The good knight had seen Germanic warriors employ these tactics from the forests of the Rhine to the moors of northern Britain, and he knew their effectiveness. Discipline and determination could overcome almost any obstacle, given time and courage enough. The British kings sat their horses behind their battle line, and the good knight could see them conferring in urgent whispers. Coinmail pointed toward the Saxon left flank, where the ground rose slightly and might offer an advantage to attacking cavalry. Condidan shook his head, gesturing instead toward the center, where Cowlin's banner flew proudly above the advancing warriors. Farinmail said nothing, but his hand rested on his sword hilt, and his eyes never left the approaching enemy. The good knight understood their dilemma. They had perhaps one chance to break the Saxon advance, one moment when surprise and desperation might overcome discipline and numbers. But they could not agree on where to strike, and every second of delay made their situation more desperate. The Saxon shield wall was drawing closer, and soon it would be too late for any stratagem save direct confrontation. It was Farinmail who acted first. With a wild cry that seemed to tear itself from his very soul, he spurred his horse forward, his sword gleaming in the morning sun. His warriors followed without hesitation, their loyalty to their king overcoming any doubts they might have harbored about the wisdom of the charge. The good knight watched them thunder across the valley floor, their war cries echoing off the surrounding hills, their spear points lowered for the impact that would determine their fate. The Saxon response was immediate and devastating. The front rank of the shield wall knelt, bracing their spears against the ground at an angle that would gut any horse foolish enough to charge directly into them. The second rank kept their shields high, protecting both themselves and their kneeling comrades from the British cavalry. It was a maneuver they had practiced countless times, and they executed it with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Farinmail's charge struck the Saxon line like a wave breaking against a cliff. The good knight saw horses impaled on Saxon spears, their screams of agony mixing with the war cries of their riders. Some of the British warriors managed to leap from their dying mounts, landing among the Saxon ranks with swords already swinging. But they were few, and they were surrounded, and the outcome was never in doubt. The good knight watched Farinmail himself fall, his horse collapsing beneath him as 3 Saxon spears found their mark. The British king rolled clear of his mount and came up fighting, his sword cutting down one Saxon warrior before a second struck him from behind. He fell to his knees, blood streaming from a wound in his back. But still he fought, his blade weaving a deadly pattern around him until sheer weight of numbers brought him down. The death of Farin Mail sent a shudder through the British ranks. The GoodKnight could see it in their faces, the sudden realization that their cause was hopeless, that they were witnessing not just the death of a king, but the end of their world. Some began to edge backward, their courage failing in the face of Saxon discipline and their own mounting losses. But Coinmail and Condedan were made of sterner stuff. The GoodKnight watched as the two remaining kings rode along their battle line, shouting encouragement to their warriors, reminding them of what they fought for: their homes, their families, their very identity as a people. Gradually, the British line steadied, and the retreat stopped. The Saxons, meanwhile, had reformed their ranks and resumed their advance. They stepped over the bodies of Farin Mail's warriors without a glance, their shields locked together, their spears leveled. Saulen rode behind them, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield as he urged his men forward. The GoodKnight could see the confidence in the Saxon king's bearing, the certainty of a man who had never known defeat and did not expect to experience it now. The second phase of the battle began when the Saxon shield wall finally reached the main British line. The GoodKnight had witnessed many such moments over the centuries, but each one was unique. Each one carried its own particular horror and beauty. This time, it was the sound that struck him most forcefully. The crash of shield against shield, the scrape of iron on iron, the grunts and curses of men straining against each other with every ounce of strength they possessed. The British line held for a moment, their desperation giving them strength beyond their numbers. The GoodKnight saw individual acts of heroism that would have been worthy of song had there been anyone left to sing them. A young British warrior, barely old enough to grow a beard, held his section of the line single-handedly for precious minutes, his spear darting like a serpent's tongue to keep 3 Saxon warriors at bay. An older man, his hair grey with age and his face scarred by a dozen battles, fought with the calm efficiency of a master craftsman, each stroke of his sword precisely calculated to inflict maximum damage. But heroism, the GoodKnight knew, was not always enough. The Saxons had numbers and discipline on their side, and they pressed their advantage relentlessly. Gradually, inevitably, the British line began to bend, then to break. The GoodKnight watched as gaps appeared in their formation, gaps that the Saxons were quick to exploit. Saxon warriors poured through the breaches, attacking the British from behind, rolling up their flanks with methodical efficiency. It was then that Coinmail made his final gambit. The GoodKnight saw the British king gather his personal retinue around him, perhaps 24 of his finest warriors, men who had sworn to die before they would see their lord dishonored. Together, they charged directly at the Saxon center, directly at the banner of King Saulen himself. The charge was magnificent in its futility. The GoodKnight watched as Coinmail's warriors carved a bloody path through the Saxon ranks, their swords rising and falling like the hammers of gods, their war cries drowning out even the clash of weapons. For a moment, it seemed as though they might actually reach their target, might strike down the Saxon king and turn the tide of battle through sheer audacity. But Saulen was no mere figurehead. The GoodKnight had observed the Saxon king's rise to power, had seen him fight in the shield wall alongside his warriors, had witnessed his tactical brilliance in previous campaigns. Now he proved his worth once again, rallying his personal guard and meeting Coinmail's charge head-on. The two kings met in single combat while their warriors fought and died around them. The GoodKnight watched, transfixed, as Coinmail's sword rang against Saulen's shield, as the Saxon king's spear thrust was turned aside by British mail. These were not the clumsy blows of exhausted men, but the precise, deadly strikes of master warriors at the height of their powers. But Coinmail was fighting alone, while Saulen had the support of his entire army. The GoodKnight saw a Saxon warrior strike the British king from behind, opening a wound in his sword arm that weakened his grip. Another Saxon spear found the gap between Coinmail's helmet and his mail shirt, and the British king staggered, blood streaming down his neck. Still Coinmail fought on, his sword weaving desperate patterns in the air around him, but his strength was failing, and his enemies were many. The GoodKnight watched as the British king fell to one knee, then to both, his sword finally slipping from nerveless fingers. Tseolin's own blade ended his suffering, and the second British king joined his comrade in death. That left only Condidon, and the GoodKnight could see that the youngest of the three kings understood his fate. The British battle line was collapsing all around him, his warriors falling back in growing disorder, their courage finally broken by the death of their leaders. But Condidon did not flee. Instead, he dismounted from his horse and took his place in the shield wall, fighting alongside his men as an ordinary warrior. The GoodKnight found himself moved by this gesture. Here was a king who understood that leadership meant more than giving orders from a safe distance, who was willing to share the fate of his followers even when that fate was clearly death. It was a quality the GoodKnight had seen in the greatest rulers throughout history, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of honor and duty. The end came quickly after that. The Saxon shield wall closed around the last knot of British resistance, like the jaws of some great beast. The GoodKnight watched as Condidon fell beneath a dozen Saxon spears, his death marking the final collapse of British resistance. The survivors scattered across the countryside, some seeking refuge in the nearby woods, others fleeing toward the distant Welsh mountains where they might find sanctuary among their kinsmen. But the battle was over, and the Saxons had won. The GoodKnight sat motionless on his horse, watching as Cowlin's warriors moved across the battlefield, finishing the wounded and stripping the dead of their weapons and armor. It was a scene he had witnessed countless times before, yet it never failed to affect him. The sudden silence after the storm of battle, the way the morning mist seemed to rise from the blood-soaked ground, the cries of the carrion birds already circling overhead. Cowlin himself stood over the body of Coinmail, his sword still in his hand, his face grim with the knowledge of what his victory had cost. The GoodKnight could see that the Saxon king took no joy in the deaths of his enemies. This had been a necessary battle, a step in the larger strategy of conquest and consolidation, but it had also been a tragedy. 3 kings had died this day. 3 kingdoms had fallen, and an entire way of life had passed into history. The GoodKnight thought of the 3 cities that would now pass into Saxon hands: Gloucester, Cirencester, and Bath. The irony was not lost on him. Cowlin had fought this battle to claim these prizes, but what had he actually won? Empty shells, ruins of a former glory, symbols of a power that no longer existed. The real victory was not in the capture of the cities themselves, but in what that capture represented: the final severing of the connection between the Britons of Wales and their kinsmen in the southwest. From this day forward, the 2 British populations would be separated by a corridor of Saxon-controlled territory. They would no longer be able to support each other in times of crisis, no longer be able to maintain the cultural and linguistic connections that had bound them together since time immemorial. The Battle of Diorham had not just been a military victory for the Saxons, it had been a strategic masterstroke that would reshape the ethnic and political map of Britain for centuries to come. But victories, the GoodKnight knew, always came with a price. The Saxons had won the day, but they had also inherited the problems that came with ruling a mixed population of conquerors and conquered. How would they govern the British survivors who remained in the captured territories? How would they maintain the complex systems of agriculture and trade that sustained civilized life? How would they defend their new possessions against the next wave of invaders who would surely come? These were questions that would be answered in the years and decades to come. For now, there was only the immediate aftermath of battle, the counting of the dead, the division of the spoils, the long march to claim the cities that had been won with so much blood. The GoodKnight watched as Saxon messengers rode off in all directions, carrying news of the victory to distant parts of Cowlin's kingdom, summoning the administrators and settlers who would transform military conquest into lasting political control. The sun was climbing higher now, burning away the last wisps of mist and revealing the battlefield in all its stark reality. The GoodKnight could see the full extent of the carnage, hundreds of bodies scattered across the valley floor, British and Saxon alike, their blood soaking into the ancient soil of Britain. It was a sight that would haunt the dreams of the survivors for years to come, a reminder of the price that had been paid for this day's work. Yet there was also something strangely peaceful about the scene. The violence was over, the shouting had died away, and the countryside was returning to its natural rhythms. Birds were already beginning to sing in the nearby trees, and the GoodKnight could hear the distant lowing of cattle in the fields beyond the battlefield. Life would go on, as it always did, adapting to new circumstances, finding ways to flourish even in the shadow of tragedy. The GoodKnight turned his horse away from the battlefield and began to ride toward the distant hills where the three cities waited. He had witnessed the battle that would change the course of British history, had seen the moment when one age ended and another began. Now it was time to see what the victors would make of their prize, to observe how the empty shells of Roman Britain would be transformed into the foundations of Saxon England. Behind him, the carrion birds were already descending to claim their share of the day's harvest. The dead would feed the living, as they always had, and the cycle of life and death would continue its eternal dance. The GoodKnight had seen it all before, in other times and places, but each time it struck him anew, the terrible beauty of human existence, the way individual lives became part of a larger story that transcended any single moment or battle or kingdom. The Battle of Deorham was over, but its consequences would echo through the centuries. The GoodKnight rode on toward an uncertain future, carrying with him the memory of 3 kings who had died for a dream, and the knowledge that their sacrifice had not been in vain. They had lost the battle, but they had won something more precious, a place in the great story of human courage and sacrifice that would inspire generations yet unborn. 3 days after the battle, the GoodKnight rode through the gates of Gloucester, and the silence that greeted him was more profound than any he had experienced in centuries of wandering. His horse's hooves echoed hollowly on the ancient Roman stones, the sound seeming to mock the very notion of conquest. This was what Ceolin had fought for, what 3 British kings had died to defend. A city of ghosts, a monument to vanished glory, a crown that crumbled at the touch. The Saxon advance guard had arrived the day before, and the GoodKnight could see them scattered throughout the ruins like children playing in the bones of giants. They moved uncertainly through streets that had once bustled with merchants and citizens, their voices hushed as if they feared to wake the sleeping dead. Some had made camp in the remains of the Forum, their cooking fires sending thin streams of smoke up through gaps in the collapsed roof. Others had claimed the better-preserved buildings for themselves, hanging their shields and weapons on walls that had once displayed the portraits of Roman emperors. But there was something almost pathetic about their occupation. The GoodKnight watched a young Saxon warrior trying to make sense of a broken mosaic, tracing the fragmentary patterns with his finger as if he could divine their meaning through touch alone. Another stood before the ruins of a temple, clearly uncertain whether the crumbling statues represented gods to be honored or demons to be destroyed. They were conquerors without a conquest, victors who had inherited only emptiness. King Ceolin himself had not yet arrived. The GoodKnight knew that the Saxon king was taking his time, savoring his triumph, allowing the news of his victory to spread throughout his realm before he came to claim his prize. It was good politics, the kind of calculated display that reinforced royal authority and reminded subjects of their king's power. But it also meant that the first Saxons to enter Gloucester were ordinary warriors, men who lacked the vision to see beyond the immediate reality of decay and abandonment. The GoodKnight dismounted near what had once been the basilica and walked slowly through its ruined halls. Weeds grew between the paving stones, and small animals had made their nests in the corners where Roman magistrates had once dispensed justice. The walls still bore traces of their former grandeur, fragments of painted plaster, the occasional carved stone, the outline of doorways that had once led to chambers filled with the business of empire. But it was the silence that struck him most forcefully. This had been a place of voices, of argument and debate, of the constant hum of human activity that marked a living city. Now there was only the whisper of wind through broken walls and the distant sound of Saxon voices trying to make themselves at home in an alien landscape. The GoodKnight thought of the chronicles that would be written about this day, centuries in the future, when scholars would debate the significance of Ceawlin's victory. They would speak of the capture of 3 great cities, of the strategic blow that separated the Britons of Wales from their kinsmen in the southwest, of the moment when Saxon power reached its zenith in the west. But they would be writing about symbols, not realities. The truth was here, in these empty streets and crumbling buildings, in the hollow echo of conquest that had claimed nothing but ruins. Yet perhaps that was enough. Perhaps symbols were more powerful than realities, more lasting than the physical structures they represented. The GoodKnight had seen it before, in other times and places, the way empty crowns could still command loyalty, the way ruined cities could still inspire awe, the way the memory of greatness could outlive greatness itself. Ceawlin might be claiming only ghosts, but ghosts had their own power, their own ability to legitimize and inspire. A commotion in the street drew the GoodKnight's attention back to the present. A group of Saxon warriors had discovered something in one of the abandoned houses, a cache of Roman coins, perhaps, or some piece of artwork that had survived the decades of decay. They were arguing over its division, their voices rising in the kind of dispute that had probably echoed through these streets since the first humans had settled here. But their argument was interrupted by the arrival of a new figure, an older Saxon, his hair grey with age, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command. The GoodKnight recognized him as one of Ceawlin's senior Thanes, a veteran warrior who had fought in many campaigns and earned his king's trust through years of loyal service. The younger warriors fell silent as he approached, their dispute forgotten in the face of superior authority. "This is not a market," the old warrior said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "This is a royal city, claimed by our king through right of conquest. Nothing here belongs to you until King Ceawlin has taken his share." The younger warriors nodded reluctantly, but the GoodKnight could see the resentment in their faces. They had fought and bled for this victory, had risked their lives in the shield wall at Diorham, and now they were being told that their reward must wait upon royal pleasure. It was an old tension, one that the GoodKnight had observed in many armies throughout history, the conflict between the warrior's desire for immediate gratification and the king's need to maintain discipline and hierarchy. But the old Thegan was right, of course. The systematic looting of Gloucester would have to wait until proper procedures could be established, until the city could be formally claimed and its resources catalogued. That was how kingdoms were built, not through the random violence of individual warriors, but through the careful application of law and custom, the patient work of turning military victory into lasting political control. The GoodKnight left the Saxons to their disputes and continued his exploration of the city. He found himself drawn to the amphitheater, that great oval of stone and earth where gladiators had once fought for the entertainment of Roman crowds. The wooden seats had long since rotted away, but the basic structure remained, overgrown with grass and wildflowers, transformed from a place of artificial death into a garden of natural life. He stood in the center of the arena and tried to imagine what it had been like in its glory days. The roar of the crowd, the clash of weapons, the smell of blood and sand and fear. Now there was only the buzz of insects and the rustle of wind through the grass. The transformation was complete. The circle of violence had become a circle of peace, and the GoodKnight found himself oddly comforted by the change. It was here that King Ceawlin found him, 3 hours later, when the Saxon king finally arrived to claim his prize. The good knight heard the sound of horses and voices long before he saw them, the noise of a royal procession making its way through the empty streets of Gloucester. He remained where he was, standing in the center of the overgrown arena, and waited for the king to come to him. Ceawlin entered the amphitheater alone, leaving his retinue outside. The Saxon king was an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his beard streaked with grey, his eyes the color of winter sky. He wore his royal regalia with casual confidence, the gold torque around his neck, and the jeweled sword at his side, marking him as a man of power and authority. But there was something in his expression that suggested he, too, was affected by the strange atmosphere of this place. "So," Ceawlin said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space, "this is what we fought for." The good knight said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. The Saxon king walked slowly around the perimeter of the arena, his boots crushing the wildflowers that had grown up between the ancient stones. He seemed to be taking the measure of the place, trying to understand what it had been and what it might become. "My advisors tell me this was where the Romans held their games," Ceawlin continued, "where they made men fight and die for sport." He paused, looking up at the empty tiers where spectators had once sat. "A strange custom. We fight for land, for honor, for survival, but to fight for entertainment." He shook his head. Perhaps that is why their empire fell. The good knight found himself impressed by the king's insight. Many conquerors would have been seduced by the grandeur of Roman architecture, would have tried to recreate the spectacles that had once filled these spaces. But Ceawlin understood that the empire's weakness had been as much cultural as military, that the Romans had lost something essential when they began to treat war as entertainment rather than necessity. And yet, Ceawlin said, as if reading the good knight's thoughts, they built things that last. Look at these walls, these stones. My halls are made of wood and thatch, and they will rot away in a generation or two. But this, he gestured at the amphitheater around them, this will endure long after my kingdom has crumbled to dust. It was a moment of unexpected vulnerability, and the good knight found himself studying the Saxon king with new interest. Here was a man who understood the temporary nature of his own power, who recognized that conquest was easier than creation, that destroying was simpler than building. It was a wisdom that few rulers possessed, and it suggested that Ceawlin might be capable of more than mere military success. The king seemed to shake off his momentary melancholy and returned to the practical matters at hand. "My scouts tell me that Cirencester and Bath are in similar condition," he said. "Empty shells, ruins of former glory. Not quite the prize that the bards will sing about, is it?" The good knight remained silent, but he could see that Ceawlin was working through the implications of his victory. The Saxon king had won a great battle, had eliminated 3 rival rulers, had claimed 3 famous cities. But what did it all mean if the cities were empty, if the victory was hollow, if the prize was nothing but symbols and memories? "Still," Ceawlin said, his voice growing stronger, "symbols have their power. When my people hear that I have taken Gloucester, Cirencester, and Bath, they will not ask about the condition of the buildings or the number of inhabitants. They will know that their king has claimed the heritage of Rome itself, that Saxon power now extends to the very heart of Britain." The good knight nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth of the king's words. Ceawlin understood the game he was playing, understood that politics was as much about perception as reality, that the appearance of power could be as valuable as power itself. The empty cities would be filled again, in time, with Saxon settlers and Saxon customs. The ruins would be rebuilt, the broken stones would be reused, and gradually the Roman past would be transformed into a Saxon future. But that transformation would take generations, and the good knight wondered if Ceawlin truly understood the magnitude of the task he had set for himself and his successors. It was one thing to conquer territory, quite another to govern it effectively. The Saxons would need to learn new skills, develop new institutions, find ways to integrate the surviving British population into their expanding kingdom. They would need to become more than warriors. They would need to become administrators, judges, builders, and diplomats. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the good knight's reflections. Cuthwine entered the amphitheatre, his young face flushed with excitement and pride. The prince had acquitted himself well in the battle, had proven his courage and skill in the shield wall, and now he was eager to claim his share of the glory. "Father," Cuthwine said, his voice ringing with enthusiasm. "The men are asking when they can begin the division of spoils. They've found stores of grain in some of the buildings, and there are rumors of hidden treasures in the old temples." Trowlin smiled at his son's eagerness, but the good knight could see the calculation behind the king's eyes. "Patience, my son. First, we must secure the city properly, establish our authority, make sure there are no British survivors hiding in the ruins who might cause trouble later. The spoils will wait. They have waited this long already." It was a wise decision, the good knight thought. The immediate aftermath of conquest was always the most dangerous time, when discipline could break down and victory could turn into chaos. Ceawlin understood that his real work was just beginning, that the Battle of Diorham had been only the first step in a much longer campaign of consolidation and control. The three of them, king, prince, and immortal knight, stood together in the ruins of the Roman amphitheatre as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The good knight found himself thinking about the cycles of history, the way civilizations rose and fell, the way each generation built upon the ruins of the last. The Romans had conquered the Celts, the Saxons were conquering the Romano-Britons, and someday, perhaps, others would come to conquer the Saxons in turn. But that was the future, and the good knight had learned long ago not to dwell too much on what was to come. The present was challenging enough, with its own complexities and contradictions, its own mixture of triumph and tragedy. Ceawlin had won his victory, had claimed his prize, had taken his place in the long line of conquerors who had shaped the destiny of Britain. Whether that victory would prove lasting, whether the prize would prove valuable, whether the conquest would lead to something greater than mere destruction, these were questions that only time could answer. As the shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the good knight prepared to take his leave. His work here was done, his witness complete. He had seen the battle that would be remembered as a turning point in British history, had observed the moment when Saxon power reached its zenith in the west, had watched as 3 kings died and 3 cities changed hands. But he had also seen something else, the hollow nature of conquest, the way victory could be both complete and meaningless, the way the greatest triumphs could turn to dust even as they were being celebrated. Ceawlin had won everything he had fought for, and yet in a sense he had won nothing at all. The cities were empty, the kingdoms were destroyed, the enemies were dead, but what remained was only the beginning of a much longer and more difficult struggle. The good knight mounted his horse and rode slowly through the empty streets of Gloucester, past the Saxon campfires and the ruined Roman buildings, past the ghosts of empire and the dreams of conquest. Behind him, King Ceawlin and Prince Cuthwine continued their planning, their voices echoing in the ancient amphitheatre as they discussed the future of their expanded kingdom. The Battle of Diorham was over, but its consequences would echo through the centuries. The separation of the Welsh Britons from their southwestern kinsmen was complete. The linguistic and cultural divergence that would create distinct Welsh and Cornish identities had begun, and the map of early medieval Britain had been redrawn in blood and ambition. Yet the good knight knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The Saxons would face new challenges in the years to come, rebellions from the conquered British population, invasions from other Germanic tribes, the constant struggle to maintain unity in a kingdom built on personal loyalty rather than institutional strength. Some of these challenges they would overcome, others would prove their undoing. Such was the way of all earthly kingdoms, all mortal ambitions, all human dreams of lasting glory. The stars were fully visible now. The same stars that had looked down on Celtic druids and Roman legions, on British kings and Saxon warriors, on all the countless generations who had lived and died in this ancient land. They would continue to shine long after Ceolin's kingdom had crumbled, long after the Saxon conquest had become merely another chapter in the long story of British history, long after the very names of the combatants had been forgotten by all save the most dedicated scholars. But for now, in this moment, the victory belonged to the Saxons. They had fought and won, had claimed their prize, had written their names in the annals of history with the blood of their enemies. It was enough, perhaps, for one lifetime. It was enough for one battle, one day, one moment in the endless cycle of human ambition and achievement. The good knight rode on through the night, leaving behind the empty city and its new masters, carrying with him the memory of 3 kings who had died for a dream and 1 king who had lived to claim a hollow crown. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of Saxon voices raised in song, celebrating their victory, proclaiming their triumph to the uncaring stars. But the stars had seen it all before, and they would see it all again. Kingdoms would rise and fall, conquerors would come and go, and the ancient land would endure, patient and eternal, waiting for the next chapter in its long and bloody story to begin. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more, or